Nezahualcóyotl, the great tlatoque of Texcoco, lies on his back, dying. In his 70s, he has ruled over his Altepet for 40 years, ascending to the royal reed mat as a reward for his role in the War of the Triple Alliance, the war which had defeated Azcapotzalco and created the Aztec Empire. With over 120 children from all his wives and concubines, he summons his most favored children to his side as he recounts the achievements of his life for one last time. His witnessing of his father strangled by the hands of Maxtla, his banishment to Tlaxcala, the war against Azcapotzalco, the capture and sacrifice of Maxtla, the murder of his brothers to secure the speakership, the decades of achievement in sciences and the arts that he has presided over in his tenure. He inherited a city from his father and leaves behind a kingdom. These are the ramblings of an old man, spoken aloud so that he can remind himself one last time that he is still alive. The princes and princesses listen patiently to their lord and father, but they hardly hear a word, for the question of succession is at the front of everyone's mind. It is at this point that a bolt of lucidity strikes Nezahualcóyotl. Out from under the vestments, he presents his youngest son, Nezahualpili, and names him his heir. Barely 9 years old, Nezahualpili can hardly understand the importance and danger of this decision. Nezahualcóyotl, with his dying breaths, makes his final proclamation. What goes unsaid, this boy is also the preferred successor of Tenochtitlan. Is it truly the will of Nezahualcóyotl to name this boy his heir, or is it one last move from Nezahualcóyotl to protect his beloved Altepet from the destruction of its tempestuous partner? History will never know. Nezahualcóyotl draws his last breath and passes on into the heavens. Before his body is even cold, Tenochtitlan moves to secure the election of Nezahualpili. The continuity of Texcoco is guaranteed, and a succession crisis is averted. But in the process, the facade of the Altepet's choice becomes even clearer, and a fire is lit under the lake which will simmer until it boils into all-out conflict which threatens to evaporate the empire at its zenith. Hello, and welcome to Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast dedicated to seeing the history of the Americas from within the visions of the people who lived it. I'm your host, Gavrilo Z. The Aztec Empire didn't fall because strangers were stronger. It cracked because its center became too heavy. Tenochtitlan's slow conversion of the Triple Alliance into a single-party machine created pressures the system couldn't bear. When its most important junior partner, Texcoco, unraveled, the empire didn't collapse so much as implode from within. And that implosion is the true context in which the Spanish made themselves useful. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In this episode, we will focus on the late Aztec period primarily through the perspective of Ixtlilxochitl, the banished prince of Texcoco who, like his grandfather Nezahualcóyotl, schemed from afar on how he would be able to leverage a political crisis into a successful bid for power, and how later indigenous historians would rewrite him not as a traitor to the empire, but a visionary of Spanish and indigenous collaboration in the New Mexico. Let's meet this prince and his divided kingdom in this week's episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a podcast where history isn't a story repeating, but a conspiracy unfolding. Episode 4, Ixtlilxochitl and the Fire Under the Lake. The people of Texcoco had come to the valley in much the same way as the Mexica, migrants from a faraway land, one of the other 7 caves of Chicomostac. Once in the valley, they had married into the illustrious bloodline of the Toltecs and founded their own Altepet on the eastern shore of the lake which shared its name. Known in history today as the Paris of ancient Mexico, the Altepet of Texcoco had inherited the Toltecs' mastery of architecture and artistry, producing many fine buildings and codices which captured the history of their people and the valley they lived in. The daughters of its nobility were highly sought after for the prestige of their bloodline, and their princes commanded high respect. By the time of Tenochtitlan's founding, Texcoco had long been under the influence of Azcapotzalco and its tlatoque Tezozomoc. Where Tenochtitlan was eager to accept its vassalage to Tezozomoc in exchange for safety and stability they had never known before, Texcoco, with its own proud heritage, had bristled under this relationship. When Tezozomoc died, it was his son Mashla who had summoned the Tlatoani of Texcoco and murdered him in an attempt to consolidate his own power. The plan backfired spectacularly, setting in motion a chain of events that led to the murdered Tlatoani's son, Ixtlilxochitl, to inherit the royal reedmat of Texcoco and lead an uprising, in conjunction with Tenochtitlan, which toppled Mashla and reconstituted power in the valley under a partnership in which Tenochtitlan and Texcoco were paramount. As the decades passed, tlatoque in both Tenochtitlan and Texcoco came and went. And with each transition, power reconstituted itself once more to reflect the subtle shifts that took place in between the pretty speeches and courtly politics of governance. The election of Moctezuma II in 1502 marked a decisive turning point in the functioning of the Aztec Empire. As you may recall from our third episode on Ixtlilxochitl, the deputy emperor and architect of the empire for over 60 years, the Aztec Empire was more a triple alliance between the three Altepeme than it was a singular government. It was a political arrangement improvised in wartime, and it only made sense that its militarism would carry on into peacetime, always looking for the opportunity of freshly spilled blood to renew its vitality. And so when the dust settled, each of the three triumphant powers, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan, devised a complicated system of tribute owed to them by the rest of the valley. This was roughly divisible as 40-40-20, with Tenochtitlan and Texcoco receiving the dominant but equal shares, with Tlacopan, by far the smallest of the three, receiving the junior amount. When the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan died, as they so often did, it was the Tlatoani of Texcoco who, in combination with the Tenochtitlan electors and the Machiavellian Tlatoque, gave the most important contributing votes as to who would be his successor. And with the succession of each Tlatoani, Texcoco saw its influence hold less and less sway into who should succeed. This was, no doubt, the design of Ixtlilxochitl, the power behind the throne, who did everything in his ability to recast his once downtrodden Altepet into a universal power, one which did not require the assent of Texcoco. By the time that Tlatoani Huitzil died from injuries sustained in an engineering disaster in the city in 1502, the Council of Electors in Tenochtitlan, which did meet, did not even pretend to consult the tlatoque of Texcoco and Tlacopan. Matters of Tenochtitlan would now be decided by the city alone. This was symbolic of a shift within the Tenochca ruling philosophy that would come to dominate the rulership of Moctezuma II in the time before the Spanish arrival. Previously, conquered Altepeme were only made to give tribute to the Triple Alliance under very exact terms, but were otherwise left alone to conduct their affairs as they saw fit. While they had to incorporate Ixtlilxochitl as a god within their pantheon, the Mexica saw no reason to demand their conquered subjects stop worshipping their own gods, and, in fact, often added the gods of these newly acquired Altepeme within their own pantheon. This empire was not Rome, and the Aztecs saw no reason to Mexicanize the people into one common identity, a facet of their rule that would have its benefits and costs, as we will see. In exchange, the Aztecs guaranteed that anyone within their lands would be safe from marauders or attack by other Altepeme, and that trade was to be encouraged and protected within the empire, allowing an exchange of goods from the various regions to grow year over year. The markets of both Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco reflected this acquisition of goods from the various Altepeme and boasted a staggering variety of animals, jewelry, featherwork, raw materials, fruits, and other foods which could all be negotiated and traded fairly in a system of trade that was linked to cacao beans as a baseline unit of measurement, with capital punishment doled out to anyone who was caught cheating another in trade. This system allowed for a massive redistribution of resources across long distances that equaled or surpassed anything achieved by the Europeans, and rivaled even that of China, though, of course, at the time, no one could have made such comparisons. But Moctezuma II envisioned a different sort of empire, one in which the influence of Tenochtitlan was felt more directly. The cornerstone of Moctezuma's ambitions was to redefine the empire into something akin to provinces which would be directly administered by appointed representatives of Tenochtitlan in order to move beyond the face-to-face interactions of dispatched emissaries into something that represented more perpetual oversight and control over the politics of these Altepeme. This system of bureaucratic reforms installed Mexican diplomats and emissaries in all Altepeme across the valley, including in the partner cities of Tlacopan and Texcoco. These Mexica officials were meant to report on the activities of these city-states directly to Moctezuma himself, in a system that was transforming the Aztec Empire from a loose confederation into a centralized authoritarian state in a manner similar to what European powers like France and Spain had begun to do a century earlier. In addition, Moctezuma set up military garrisons across the empire, near-permanent standing armies which would be able to act locally against any upstart Altepet which began to think about resisting the encroaching influence of Tenochtitlan. The problem of internal rebellion detracting from external conquest was, for the time being, resolved. And so the reforms continued, expanding into spheres of political activity that had been previously unknown to the people of the empire. Mexica officials were appointed to arbitrate disputes between claimants to thrones, marriages, and political alliances between subordinate Altepeme. They acted as a kind of judge in domestic matters, and even dispensed judgments and punishments in cases where disputes of property or trade arose. It was beginning to become a sophisticated empire whose political control was near total from Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma's predecessors had established the boundaries of the empire, but it was Moctezuma himself who had now established the possibilities of what the empire could accomplish in itself. His authority had become so great that later, decades after the ruin of this empire, Don Fernando de Alva Ixtlilxochitl, great-great-grandson of the Texcocan contemporary of Moctezuma, would write, "Moctezuma found himself on the greatest throne that he or his ancestors had ever held. The whole empire was in his hands. And so, considering the great power he had, he did not believe that he could be conquered by any ruler, even the greatest in the world." This was another marked shift of power, and one that would breed resentment across the empire, as Altepeme bristled at the further intrusion of these demanding Mexica into their own affairs. Since the founding of the empire in 1427, Tenochtitlan had seen 6 different tlatoque come and go: Ixtlilxochitl, Moctezuma, Axayacatl, Tizoc, Huitzotl, and now Moctezuma II. Their reigns often lasted little more than a decade, with many of them dying in their 30s or 40s due to injury, illness, or suspected assassination. Though the election of a new Tlatoani always ended up in a unanimous vote with no major rival to the throne contesting the results, the constant shuffling of tlatoque meant there were moments of instability and crisis within the empire. Opportunities in which conquered Altepeme would revolt and the new Tlatoani would have to muster an army to squash the rebellion. For as much as the Tenochca legitimized their rule through conquest and tribute, there was the constant threat of challenges to its rule from Altepet which chafed under their rulership. Texcoco, on the other hand, experienced an impressive level of continuity in its leadership. Its first Tlatoani of the Triple Alliance era had been Ixtlilxochitl, the once banished prince who had seen his own father murdered by Maxtla in Azcapotzalco and fled to Tlaxcala before being recruited by Ixtlilxochitl to exact revenge. With the war secured, Ixtlilxochitl assisted Ixtlilxochitl in murdering all of his brothers and potential rivals to the throne. In Ixtlilxochitl's eyes, these brothers were traitors who had all bent the knee to Azcapotzalco. With these rivals vanquished, Ixtlilxochitl formally crowned Ixtlilxochitl the Tlatoani of Texcoco, a position he would hold uninterrupted for 43 years. During that time, Ixtlilxochitl, half Mexica through his mother, established himself as a legendary ruler, composing enormous amounts of poetry, some of which still survives, and overseeing one of the most impressive feats of engineering of his era by constructing a dike across the north-south divide of Lake Texcoco, a feat of engineering that helped to separate the salt water of the eastern side of the lake from the fresh water of the west. His influence was such that, even today's Mexico, he is honored as one of the great indigenous forebears of the country and a source of enormous national pride. When Ixtlilxochitl died, his son Nezahualpili ascended to the throne in an uncontested election in the year 1472, one determined in advance by the Mexica. Nezahualpili carried on the traditions of his father by being a poet in his own right, and led an enlightened regime that favored astronomers and engineers as well as artisans and scholars. He was, in many ways, a forward-thinking king who, as all responsible Tlatoani were expected to, prioritized the safety and continuity of his people as his first real charge. He also struggled mightily to retain the independence of Texcoco within the Triple Alliance. This interference with Texcocan sovereignty had begun from the beginning of Nezahualpili's crowning as Tlatoani. He had been just 9 years old upon the death of his father, and had over 100 siblings and half-siblings that his father had sired over the course of his lifetime. Many of these had as much of a legitimate claim to being Tlatoani as Nezahualpili, who in any case was surely too young to defend his own title. The tlatoque of Tenochtitlan, Ixtlilxochitl, however, had decided that now was the time to exercise the might of his power in deciding on a successor in Texcoco that would benefit Tenochtitlan the most. In a move that would play out repeatedly in the history of the empire, Ixtlilxochitl gathered a force of warriors and entered Texcoco to dictate the terms of Nezahualpili's inheritance at the expense of all of his brothers. Ixtlilxochitl paid off the brothers he could with land grants and titles and butchered those he could not convince. Later Spanish chroniclers would be baffled at the enormity of claimants to the throne. In their worldview, only the eldest legitimate son was eligible to inherit the throne, and the concept of dozens of brothers from nearly as many mothers would have baffled them. Yet another example of these two cultures fated to meet, seeing each other through the distortion of their own perspective. In fact, the problem was seen by the Aztecs themselves in their own time, going as far back as the reign of the first Moctezuma in the mid-1400s. Tlatoque and other nobles of the Altepeme had so many wives and children that the number of nobles exploded, and it was doubtful that there were enough people within the empire to exact tribute from in order to support all of this aristocracy. An elderly Nahua woman, not long after the conquest by the Spanish, reminisced on the times before the destruction of her empire, saying that, "Back when I was growing up, there was an infinite number of nobles. How many noble houses there were, the palaces of those who were nobles and rulers. It was like one big palace. There were countless minor lords and lesser relatives, and one could not count the commoners who were their dependents or the slaves. They were like ants." It was a problem with real political repercussions that were playing out now in the succession of the tlatoque of Texcoco. With Ixtlilxochitl's intervention, Nezahualpili's brothers were all bought off or murdered, and Nezahualpili was set to inherit the throne, undoubtedly with a regent acceptable to Tenochtitlan until the boy came of age himself. This ensured the continuity of Texcoco and averted a wider war, but also established a precedent of Mexica interference in Texcocan politics that would soon become a source of great consternation in Nezahualpili's eventual would-be successors. Though it had been thoroughly subordinated to Tenochtitlan in the hierarchy of power, Texcoco remained a vitally important city. Simply put, Tenochtitlan needed a loyal and orderly Texcoco to sustain its own position in the valley and beyond. With both the election of Nezahualcoyotl and then Nezahualpili to the speakership of Texcoco, Mexica hands had dictated the internal politics of Texcoco for the last 75 years. And with the death of Nezahualpili eventually, Tlatoani Moctezuma II would once again use Mexica warriors to direct the path of Texcocan succession. Unlike previous attempts, however, this time there was a Texcocan prince who refused to stand by and watch Texcocan sovereignty be violated once again. His name was Ixtlilxochitl, named after his great-grandfather, the tlatoque of Texcoco who had been murdered by Maxtla at the beginning of the War of the Triple Alliance. Born in 1500, Ixtlilxochitl was said to have been prophesied by his father's court magicians and sorcerers to be a man who had once turned against the people of his own blood. It goes that the magicians, seeing dark portents in this prince, urged Nezahualpili to murder the infant to prevent a grim fate for Texcocans. Nezahualpili refused. Uniquely, Nezahualpili was a monotheist, believing in one supreme god as opposed to the typical Nahuatl pantheon, and said that this supreme god would have a plan for his son, and that it was a heresy to intervene. This story was recorded in Alva Ixtlilxochitl in his History of the Chichimeca Nation, and undoubtedly reflects the Christian overtones of the converted Texcocan historian. Another of history's conversations between past and present fusing together to produce one inseparable myth. Strong and brash, it was said that Ixtlilxochitl killed his own nursemaid when he was 3 years old for violating his father's law and flirting with men out of marriage. At 7, he was said to have conducted other boys in mock armies and waged military campaigns of great imagination. He was accused by members of the court of being too bellicose, and the advisors once again pleaded for the tlatoque to put his son to death if he could not control him. Again, Nezahualpili refused. Ixtlilxochitl, it is said upon learning of this, found the advisors and had his own men beat and hanged them. Opposite of Ixtlilxochitl stood another of Nezahualpili's sons, Cacama. Born of a Mexica mother and nephew to Moctezuma, Cacama was said to have been the favorite of his father. Born in 1483, he was 17 years older than his brother, already a middle-aged man by the time of his father's death. And this age gap would be used to his advantage in securing the bid for power. These sons of Nezahualpili had already seen Tenochtitlan interfere in Texcoco politics before. Back in the days of Ixtlilxochitl, The Tlatoani had died from wounds sustained in battle and was followed by the brief reign of his brother and successor Tizoc, who also soon died and was replaced by another brother, Ixtlilxochitl. Ixtlilxochitl had resented that his brother Aztec had been chosen before him, and now looked to make his own mark on the politics of the empire. Aztec, before dying, had married off one of his own daughters to Nezhualpili in order to promote an heir to the Texcocan throne that would be of his own bloodline. After the death of Aztec and the ascension of Ixtlilxochitl sought to undo this and insisted, with disputed evidence, that his niece had committed adultery with 2 other men, a crime punishable by death in Aztec law. Nezhualpili appealed this decision, but was overruled and forced to put to death his Tenochtitlan wife, only to have her replaced by a daughter of Ixtlilxochitl. It was another instance of Tenochtitlan interference in the politics of Texcoco, and the insults and the injuries were beginning to pile up in the eyes and memory of Ixtlilxochitl. Ixtlilxochitl and then Moctezuma began to centralize the empire, while Nezhualpili appealed and negotiated for the continued independence of Texcoco within this system, and year by year found that the independence was being steadily chipped away. And by all accounts, it was only the personal relationship between Nezhualpili and Moctezuma that kept Texcoco independent at all. But even that relationship was often put to the test. It was said that once Nezhualpili had seen an omen that great destruction was to come to the Aztec Empire in the form of strangers who would upend the existing order. As the story goes, Moctezuma turned to his own court magicians, who then challenged their Tlatoani on the accuracy of those predictions, and responded, "What can we say? The future has already been determined and decreed in heaven, and Moctezuma will behold and suffer a great mystery which will come to pass in his land. If our king wishes to know more about it, he will soon know enough, for it comes swiftly. This is what we predict, since he demands that we speak, and since it must surely take place, he can only wait for it." Moctezuma did not appreciate this answer. Disturbed, he challenged Nezhualpili to a best-of-5 rubber ball game so beloved across Mesoamerica. Moctezuma wagered that if he were to win, the predictions were false, but if Nezhualpili were to win, it meant that the Texcocan Tlatoani was correct, and a bad omen had been seen which fated the destruction of this empire. The game soon began, and Moctezuma easily bested Nezhualpili in the first 2 matches, but then he lost the next 3 in quick succession. Victory had been within Moctezuma's grasp, and then disappeared completely. It was as if the gods were telling the Tlatoani that the joys he would feel in conquest were equally ephemeral, and that all that he knew would come to pass like this ballgame. It was a disturbing omen to Moctezuma, who brooded on its significance for some time. It seemed that for all of the Mexica influence on Texcoco over the generations, there were fates beyond even Tenochtitlan's control that were at play, and fates that would have the final say on the destiny of the empire. But Moctezuma wished to have his say on destiny now. Nezhualpili's victory over Moctezuma was a humiliation for the Mexica Tlatoani. He schemed to put Texcoco in its place. Texcocan historian Alva Ixtlilxochitl asserts that Moctezuma, whose desire to be an absolute ruler he described as insatiable, schemed for a way to curtail Nezhualpili's power. In the historian's writing, he alleges that Moctezuma conspired with his arch-rivals, the Tlaxcalans, to hatch a plan to eliminate the armies of Texcoco and consolidate the power of Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma is said to have warned the Tlaxcalans that Nezhualpili planned to attack and raise Tlaxcala and take the lands for himself. The Tlaxcalans, whose ancestors had once assisted Nezhualpili's, were enraged by the idea. They countered with a surprise attack on the Texcocan army and massacred them all, including 2 sons of Nezhualpili's. The Tlatoani lamented at this betrayal and the death of his children and went into a deep depression for the rest of his life. Whatever the truth of this story may be, it is indicative of how far Tenochtitlan-Texcocan relations had fallen that Alva Ixtlilxochitl would write of this betrayal in his history at all. These were once 2 partners who, while never quite equal, had co-ruled an empire in peace. But Tenochtitlan's ambition for total power in the valley saw neither friend nor foe, and the Tlatoani of the capital would do whatever it took to consolidate its interests. Upon the death of his sons at the hands of the Tlaxcalans, Nezhualpili retreats into the seclusion of his palace. This once great Tlatoani, whose contributions to poetry, astronomy, and the Nahuatl sciences have been immense, finds no more joy in discovery in his old age. He inherited a kingdom. Now, after decades of his rule, he was leaving behind a vassal state. The tlatoque of Tenochtitlan had humiliated his altepet and bit by bit erased its sovereignty. Slights that had been forgiven in the name of maintaining the peace had only grown. Now an old man, Neswalpili feels powerless to hold off the schemes of Moctezuma. His nation's army is in tatters, his tributaries are refusing their obligations with the permission of Tenochtitlan, and his kingdom is in ruins. He reflects on his fate through poetry that he composes, reciting to himself line by line his final laments. Looking upon the codices of his ancestors, he wonders what his place in the history of his people will be, if any. The final months pass on. Beset by illnesses, Neswalpili spends most of his days on his reed mat, aching with the indignities of old age. Medicine men and magicians crowd him where he lies, performing desperate rituals to keep their speaker alive. What their spells and elixirs can't do, however, is restore the will to rule that has by now escaped Neswalpili. Funerary rites are prepared. The Tlatoani's sons are sent for, Cacama and Ixtlilxochitl. Both sons pay respect to their father with one eye on his body and the other on each other. The knives will come out the moment their father dies. In his final moments, weak in body and spirit, Neswalpili finds that he cannot even find the strength to designate his successor. The hour comes. Neswalpili summons a deep breath, as deep as he can, and closes his eyes, ready to join the big sleep of his ancestors and take his rightful place by the side of his fathers and theirs. The Tlatoani of Texcoco has died, and, with him, the last living memory of his altepet's sovereignty. Beset by grief, Neswalpili died in 1515. The greatest succession crisis within the Triple Alliance would then begin. Cacama, the half-Mexican nephew of Moctezuma, who was Tenochtitlan's favored candidate, and Ixtlilxochitl, who believed Moctezuma responsible for the death of his father, each announced their intentions to succeed Neswalpili. Moctezuma moved quickly to orchestrate a vote in favor of Cacama. Ixtlilxochitl, young and proud and incensed at the insults Texcoco had endured by the Mexica, argued bitterly before storming out of Tenochtitlan to return to Texcoco. Ixtlilxochitl went to the northern towns of his kingdom, who were more closely related to him than Cacama, and gathered an army. A bloody civil war broke out. Cacama appealed for assistance from Tenochtitlan while gathering an army of Texcoco's central Altepeme. He marched on Texcoco and threatened to sack the city. Moctezuma, in response, sent generals to kidnap and kill Ixtlilxochitl. But the prince was aware of this, and captured his assailants and burned them alive in response. The campaigns went on. Despite the early successes of Ixtlilxochitl, no brother was able to achieve total victory. Cacama didn't dare march on the northern territories with Ixtlilxochitl's army encircling Texcoco itself, while Ixtlilxochitl found that he could not bear the thought of attacking the altepet of his father and his father's fathers. Moctezuma, wishing for a quick end to it all before the conflict metastasized into a larger empire-wide civil war, made a compromise. Cacama would be given the central Altepeme of the Texcocan sphere of influence, including the city itself, while Ixtlilxochitl would be allowed to retain control over, but not be named Tlatoani of, the northern Altepeme. This delicate division of power had its obvious parallel in the division of the Aztec Empire itself, a division that was now proving to be uniquely unstable in maintaining a balance. The conflict, though, was settled for the meantime, but the lasting damage of the settlement would only become apparent in time. The Mexica had, in the eyes of Ixtlilxochitl, crossed the line in determining who would rule Texcoco, dividing up the land into 3 parts and weakening the once great Altepet even further, with the obvious outcome of strengthening Moctezuma's own hand. With Tlacopan even further relegated to the lowest rungs of power in the empire, what had once truly been a triple alliance was now a single-party state in which the Altepet of Tenochtitlan dictated the terms of what could and could not be within its borders. There was now a crisis brewing within the empire, with its 3 partners now at each other's throats. Altepeme across the empire revolted seasonally, and Moctezuma conscripted not only his own people, but those of his partners and tributaries to move in and crush the rebellions. Cacama acceded to these demands and sent warriors from Texcoco to assist in these campaigns, but the demands were becoming more and more taxing. The success of the Aztec Empire had been built on the continued military conquests of the Aztecs. Constant expansion and its associated tribute offset the strain of military campaigns and the losses incurred in that expansion. Back in the days of Ixtlilxochitl, the cult of Ixtlilxochitl had demanded more and more sacrifices to be made as not only an appeasement of the great god of war and the sun, but also a campaign of terror against anyone who might challenge the authority of the Mexica and their allies. It was an empire whose authority rested more on pervasive influence than outright territorial control. But this plan was now beginning to hit its practical limits. The Aztecs had found themselves butting up against the powers which they could no longer easily conquer. To the west of the empire, Ixtlilxochitl, Moctezuma's father, had mounted an enormous campaign against the Purepecha Empire that had ended in total defeat and disgraced Ixtlilxochitl for the rest of his rulership. To the south, Moctezuma's own campaigns had subdued portions of the region of Oaxaca, conquering the Mixtecs in the process, but failing to subdue the Zapotecs in their hilltop fortress of Monte Alban. Worse yet, the enclave of Tlaxcala existed as an ulcer in the center of the empire's stomach. Try as they might, tlatoque of Tenochtitlan had mounted campaign after campaign against their most despised enemy, but still failed to conquer the Tlaxcalans in their hilltop confederation. Though they had recently managed to split off Cholula at its periphery in a challenge of allegiance that had infuriated the rest of Tlaxcala. To the north of the Aztecs lay the desert and the Chichimeca, a region so desolate and barbarous the Mexica could not begin to justify conquering it at all. The empire, which had always been able to justify its worst excesses on the promise of perpetual expansion, was now beginning to hit the limits of conquest, and its conflicts were turning inward rather than expanding outward. Moctezuma spent as much time pacifying internal revolts as he did leading external conquests, and Ixtlilxochitl watched and bided his time, nursing a deep grudge against the political boss who had put his thumb on the balance of power within his beloved altepet of Texcoco. The Spanish prince knew of the struggles of the empire and waited, watching for the moment when some factor would come in and rebalance the scales in his favor. But what that would be in the year 1515 was not yet certain. There were certainly portents of something arriving, however. Though direct contact between the people of the Caribbean and the Aztecs is historically uncertain, there are suggestions that Cuban Taino were in somewhat regular contact with the Maya of the Yucatan, a fact suggested by Diego Velázquez himself when he wrote of the natives who had come to the Cuban island via canoe, in a trip that he had claimed taken them 6 days, though how he made this estimate is unknown. The Maya were surely aware of the presence of the Spaniards and the devastating effect they were having on the people of the islands beyond their own borders. When the expeditions of Córdoba and Grijalva had set sail and made contact with the Maya, they were met with limited hospitality, warnings to sail away, and occasional, though brief, armed conflict. It seems that the reputation of the Spanish was beginning to precede them. And though the Aztec had no known direct contact with the people of the Caribbean, they most assuredly had contact with the Maya. Merchants of the Aztec Empire made regular contact with various Maya tribes and traded with them. In the process, information about these strangers would have become known. A Mexica representative had even been present on the Gulf Coast when the Grijalva expedition had made contact with the Totonacs. All of this had excited the peoples of the empire who had heard it. Who were these strangers, with their strange beards, dress, weapons, and behaviors? Were they aware of the empire of the Aztecs? What were their intentions? They had demanded gold at the expense of everything else, including the jade and featherwork the people of the Fifth Sun valued much higher. All of this combined together to make an unusual time, and there were murmurings across the empire that something was in the air, a time of change. As we will see later in our episode on Moctezuma and his diplomatic strategy with the Spanish, much of these new developments were beginning to trouble the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, who gathered as much information as possible about these strangers and conferred near continuously with a council of his closest advisors, including Cacama, Tlatoani of Texcoco. Though he remained technically at war with Cacama, it is entirely likely that Ixtlilxochitl was as much aware of this information as the other leaders of the alliance, and had his own opinions and fears of what was to come from these bearded strangers from afar. But he would go on to play a very different game with the Spanish than his brother and the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. The Aztec Empire didn't so much fall as unmake itself. Moctezuma's ambition for increased power tightened the noose on his own kingdom. Texcoco's fracture was not a local quarrel. It was a structural failure, a stress fracture in an imperial skeleton. When strangers arrived, they didn't topple a monolith, they offered a lever to people who had already learned how to pry. That lever would be pulled. And, as he waited in the wings of power, Ixtlilxochitl would share exactly the point at which the leverage could break the foundation of the empire altogether. But all of that will have to wait until later. Next week, we'll return to the Spanish and rejoin Cortez's expedition to the Yucatan, where he and his band of marauders retrace the steps of Cordoba and Grijalva to make their claim on a fabled land of riches. Like the Aztecs, the Spaniards were factionalized between who was the legitimate leader of their expedition, and Cortez and his loyal captains would have to think fast to paper over the differences in their mission with the illusion of Spanish legalism and Aztec gold. So that's all for this episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On. Written, narrated, and produced by Gavrilo Z, with music composed and performed by Jake Krasiniak. If you like the show, tell your friends. All of my listeners are appreciated, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. Goodbye.